Hey, Chris Lander. So if you've been following along my recent rapid prototyping videos, this is some material I was sharing with some of my classes, also sharing with my home team people, and it's just some examples that didn't fit into the original video presentation. I want to make sure I cover, share with you, because partly this was a really influential thing for my path in game development. It's not going to take a lot of time, but the general umbrella here we're going to be talking about are just examples of things where there's games and games technology, but not necessarily mainly for entertainment. Maybe for education, for communication, for arts, art games and serious games being broad umbrellas we're going to paint a picture of here that, again, were a major part of my career inflection points. And so in your rapid prototyping practice, maybe in your professional game path, some things to be aware of are out there or to look into, or hopefully just be another lens you can apply to games besides. And there's nothing wrong with games for entertainment, games for fun, games that resemble the kind of games we grew up playing, to make you more aware of the space of these other interesting things that happen in the world around us. So one, and this is kind of seems like an obvious one when you point it out, but it's a good place I think to build on, is educational games. And so this is kind of just a recent example I saw come up. It's a game about helping kids learn the Constitution. And the thing to think about for educational games is that often, and I don't know the financial details of this one, so I can't speak to some particulars, but in many cases, educational games may be funded through a non-obvious manner that's different than when you make a commercially relevant project on Steam, on the App Store, on the Switch, on whatever, then you're trying to sell it to customers in excess of the cost of development, and that's the business model. In a lot of these cases, they're partly supported by perhaps government funding or by PhD people writing grants for where money has been put on the table to say, we need to make it more accessible or more entertaining for people to learn a new skill, for people to gain better understanding. They're struggling at math, they're struggling at financial foundations. There are things they need to understand about their life and the world around them we want to help them do. And so in many cases, those can become supported that way, or through eventually through building up contracts and deals with, they have a supporting curriculum around it, classrooms can integrate it, and it's just another way that games-related technology finds its way into our lives. And the thing to keep in mind for educational games, so for my generation growing up, it was Oregon Trail playing on the Apple IIes. You might have seen the memes. But even that was, I think, the learning company was partly founded by, it was Warren Robnett, a game developer, historically partnering with someone who had the academic credentials to get access to those grants. But the thing to keep in mind for those is that the bar they're trying to beat, right? Even when we played Oregon Trail, it wasn't better than Mario when we went home. It wasn't better than what we had on our home PCs, Wolfenstein 3D at the time or whatever. And this still is not trying to compete against Fortnite and Minecraft, whatever the kids want to play at the moment. It's trying to compete against what is the classroom experience otherwise, right? Can this be more fun than the teacher explaining it? Can this be more memorable? Can this be something that's easier for them to digest? But it is realizing that oftentimes the context of this happen. This is the thing I learned from Mark Guzdial, who's a faculty at Georgia Tech, also coincidentally a friend of mine's dad, who I made games with for a bunch of years. But he helped me point out when we were looking at educational games in the space, in many cases, we first get this idea in our head somehow that we're going to make this piece of software, we're going to distribute it around the world, and then suddenly everyone's going to understand the concept, right? That's part of the joy of digital entertainment. You can get millions of people the next day to try a thing. But the trouble there is that realistically, what you're usually doing at best, even in the most successful cases, is you're not replacing the teacher or the classroom or the classmates, you're replacing the textbook. It's an artifact that still needs to be positioned and used. And so an example we look at where educational game, kind of the most successful case in history, I'm going to suggest, of an educational game in terms of what we call transfer in education. That's where someone is genuinely getting a skill or understanding they can go apply outside of it, right? They're not just entertained. They're not just finding it interesting. They are genuinely came away with new ideas, new clarity, new ability to do something or synthesize based on whatever is really flight simulators. And that's a space where even though they're sophisticated, they're well done, many of them are hyper detailed to an excruciating degree of 10-minute start routines for cold starting jets and so on. It is still the case that in order to qualify to actually operate an airplane, it's not as though someone just spends time in a flight simulator game and now they're ready to go. They in many cases still need a coach, a trainer, a teacher, somebody who is using this as an artifact to set up scenarios, guide them through it, talk them through it, ask them questions, interacting with them at a human level. And so I mentioned that not to devalue educational games, but to recognize that they fit into a greater context, to realize the bar is more realistic when you realize, again, you're replacing the textbook, not the teacher. So it's also where something like I built an educational game some years ago. This was based on when I was working on, I was helping some kids up in Malibu for a school year, helping learn coding concepts, very, very young people. And it's just an introduction to coding where when you start off, you're cracking safes by, let's see, click A to yellow, B to red, C to red, open the safe. Starts off very simple. As it gets more advanced, if you're familiar with programming, you'll see we have ifs and conditions based on this dial. Turn this one this way. If this and that. As they build up in sophistication, we start getting function calls with references, setting C to whatever variable we called in for side plan. And this syntax, of course, is human readable English. But we also have different modes in here for symbols. We have modes for programming syntax. So at the later end, they can work on, okay, set B to red, A to yellow. But it builds up granularly. It tries to lead them up to it. Other things red, other things red. And so when I'm teaching, I still have some youth clients I work with. B equals use, that was red. I'll often work with them first on this. C equals B, and this is where in the earlier ones they learn it, equal sign passes this way. B goes to C. This is free at safecotrainer.com, by the way, so B goes to C. But it's something where, again, I use it as a textbook. So an example, so Chaim Gingold, this was actually, I think, the lead designer, possibly, of the creature creator in Spore, if you're familiar with that from the old Maxis hit days. Very controversial, but also successful game. So for this one, Chaim literally did a textbook. And something that's much more recognizable as such, where it is, you're making volcanoes, you're interacting with mountains and terrain. It has some symbols, it has some learning, it has some sort of educational content in there. But again, it's very much positioned as this is an interactive digital textbook. And to realize, again, there's a room in the world for projects like this that use game technology, that use game expertise, that use game teams, that aren't necessarily in the usual sense probably going to be bestsellers on the commercial store, but fit into our lives in additional ways or different ways. Now, those have been about content, about classroom material. An example I like to point out here is Reality Ends Here. And this one's a very obtuse one that's hard to really get a handle on. What is it? What's going on here? Because it's something that is intentionally denied by the staff. And so here there's a public interview about saying some things about it. You still, when you're watching this, trying to figure out what am I looking at? And I think it's better explained by, so the Indiecade Festival celebrated this game some years ago, and they make clear it's officially unacknowledged by faculty administration, right? Part of the mystique of this, players get lured into the game with mysterious communications from Reality Committee, find their way to the game office, get indoctrinated, swear an oath, and are given a game cards with prompts to act on a generative system. But it's something that the theater students, the USC game students do that makes their orientation experience more memorable, more personalized, more unique. And just like the bar set for this is this better than a geology textbook? Is this better than just sort of trying to read an advanced adult programming book for a child learning it? Or in the case of the Constitution game, better than a lecture from a teacher? Its goal is to make this better than orientation would have been. Not necessarily at the same level of would you play this instead of, again, Baldur's Gate 3 or something. It's a very different kind of bar to explore in your design space that has a lot of opportunities in it. Now, if you're not familiar with the Games for Change Festival, it's something that every single year, but like GDC celebrates commercial and industry projects, or Indiecade celebrates more indie and student scale experimental type things. Games for Change really focuses on these sort of games that are about more serious topics, more angles on possible educational games and things. This is also where we start to see a lot more variety in the space, where some of the time what it's exploring is games for social emotional change, games for overcoming hangups about how we communicate, about seeing other parts of the world of people's lives, about rallying political efforts. You'll also see in here some projects you might recognize from Steam or Switch or other commercial spaces more popularly being successful there. Detroit Becomes Human obviously had a significant budget, so did clearly Assassin's Creed. But you'll notice here they focus on the Discovery Tour portion, where you're exploring the ancient world as part of sort of a demonstration of the game in an educational lens. And so if you're doing these kind of projects, it helps show there's a community for this stuff, a way to connect to them. Factorio, of course, again, clearly commercially successful. But a lot of these others you may not have heard of unless you go out of your way to explore this kind of space and find what are the other creators, what kind of work are they doing here in 2023 or whenever you catch this. And so it is great to see this celebration going on annually for Games for Change. Now, one of my influences in this space that'll lead me into it, reading his books, and I think I'll link this talk in the description because it's an older one, but it's a good one, is Ian Bogost. He was one of my grad advisors. And in this old talk, which he's also given more recent talks, but I find these old ones, maybe it's because that when I got into it, it was just sort of a good timing for serious games, right? He starts talking about how one of his kids played Animal Crossing, and then from that had to pay off his debt to Tom Nook for his house, and was getting exposed to this idea at a much younger age that normally didn't really get encountered till adulthood. And what an interesting lens that was for it. And part of also why his talks become so interesting for this is that he's often been doing contracting freelance consulting work with his agency he runs to help get voters out and involved, to train people at the Cold Stone Creamery on how to scoop ice cream in the correct way. He's done some games that are critical of certain business practices and things. So in general, he's been very active in the serious game space for a long time, and lots of really great insights into it. So again, there's a link I want to talk. Throw you a link down below. Again, this is an older talk. You can find lots of talks by him. So if this is not your jam, you might find others. Some examples occasionally he brings up, or I'll bring up some of my talks, etc., because they were popular at the time. But I think they're also useful for a lens on how the production quality can be a very different bar, because in some of these kind of cases, and it's true for Ian's games as well, it's almost for a lot of us a thing to discuss. And you'll see this more and more as we start to shift our discussion here from art games into what we call serious games. Darfur is Dying was an influential game from sort of the semi-indie scene. And again, in terms of production quality, you'll see that this is something that you don't have a full team of staffed, funded development studio, right? This is not trying to look AAA, even remotely. But instead, it's about the concept being presented about these children sort of trying to have to run errands. And it doesn't sugarcoat at all what's happening, the difficulties, the risks, the encounters. And so from that, it becomes a much more serious point of discussion about what's happening somewhere in the world and making people aware of an issue. And again, this is not something that necessarily is a fun experience to play or find addictive or want to get your friends into, but it's a thing to talk about. It's a thing that gets us, making us more aware of something. A smaller version of something like that, and this is one that also I learned about from Ian Bogost in one of his books. September 12th, this is a relatively lightweight. They clarify it's not even a game, right? This is you can't win or lose. It's a simulation. And it's just a single rhetorical point here of you're attacking people in this village who are terrorists. You can identify that they're dressed differently. Inevitably, there's collateral damage of other people. Civilians are losing their lives. Other civilians come and check on them, find that their friends have died, and then they turn into terrorists themselves. And it's this very, I would say, simple, but obviously somewhat simplified point about September 12th being named after September 11th for the day after. Some of the risks of how we try to handle or respond to certain problems, presenting an argument that we might be exacerbating the problem if we're not careful about our approach to solving these kind of issues in the world. And again, it's not a cohesive, it's not a political thesis in a way that's going to be published or influencing international critique, but in terms of a way to make the idea accessible to the general public to talk about, to think about. It's one of these things where once you've kind of seen this for even a few minutes, or even someone's talked to you about it for 15 seconds, maybe you've even played it, you have this other lens in your mind of a way to think about things. There's a more large version of this. This is from a developer who's done a lot of these things more seriously. Oilgarchy, another old influential game in this kind of space, in which the player is sort of playing as a simulation, operating an oil company, making those trade-offs, having to influence politicians, maybe running into difficult conflicts ethically about how to handle local people who are in the way of what's going to be profitable for your oil company and your venture. And just a very effective critique of this. I think it's Mole Industries, but still an active voice in serious types of games being done. And again, this kind of higher production budget than you'll see for some of the others. Now, there's a great talk as we start to shift more back into art games from Tale of Tales. I saw it live when I was over in Atlanta for the Art History Games Symposium. And they start off by really talking about their background in designing games. The first 5 minutes of it, it's a talk about the projects they've done up to that point. By this point, by the way, if you haven't heard of, I think it's, I'll make sure I get this right, Aria Harvey and Michael Salmon, that's the Tale of Tales developers. If you're not familiar with their work, again, that's not Telltale, that's a different game studio. Tale of Tales, they're extremely prolific artists who use games as their medium. Not to be confused with people who are necessarily game developers who are making art. There's nothing wrong with that either. But as part of this, they are cited directly as influences by people like lead designer, I think it was Uncharted 2, Rich Lamarchand, that their game about an old lady walking through a graveyard helped inspire things that happened in Uncharted 2. And then Last of Us is kind of on the record as to some of those scenes influenced them. And so these were highly influential. They still are. Designers doing very interesting things. And then after the first 5 minutes, there's this great tirade about how they are frustrated with what they see in games. And again, mind you, this was 13 years ago. So you got a kind of mental snapshot, how the world has changed. But it's a manifesto of sorts, just to help stir up action about what else games can be and do. And they even start by clarifying, right? They're not anti-game. They're not saying games shouldn't exist. They're saying that we want more. We want different things for different people. And they've done an incredible job throughout the careers of putting a stake in the ground for it. So unfortunately, the original upload for this talk, the audio quality has this really loud buzz the entire time. Just piercing. This is what I think one of the most important presentations I've seen live in person influential for me, influential probably for everybody else in the room, memorable, and again, just so hard to listen to on the original upload. It was co-organized, this symposium, by Georgia Tech and SCAD. I'm friends with and for years worked with organizers at both institutions who since have moved on to other institutions like I have, so I don't think they could give me permission to re-upload a fixed version. I also don't expect that Georgia Tech's media office is going to respond to me about a 13-year-old video with about 1,000 views because no one wants to watch how it listens to. So I'm going to try surreptitiously uploading it to a different platform with the audio fixed so you can watch it. Look in my description for a link. Please be cool about it. But I think it's important material. I think it's also in the rebellious spirit of their talk that like people need to hear this and what they're saying. So I've maybe re-uploaded that somewhere else. If it gets taken down by either institution or by the artists themselves, you know, obviously if I get a request from anybody, it'll go away. I think it's going to behoove you to hear it. And again, clearly no one wants to hear it over here. If you want to find another channel, you can. But man, this is really hard to listen to, unfortunately, on the original upload. Now, on the serious games front, we're kind of back and forth because, again, I wanted to just really kind of intentionally mix this lens a bit about how games can be and do more than just entertainment stuff in the usual lens. It can be kind of, you start to see one or two educational game examples or one or two art games, kind of simplify your lens on it. So this is by Ben Sawyer. He's been a long-time major influence. He helped run the Serious Games Summit for the years that GDC had that. He's been a part of major initiatives in serious games. He ran a consulting agency for many years. I think he might still be doing it. And he was influential and led me into game development. My monitor's always sitting on a book he wrote when I was a kid that has a section about, still to this day, about my approach as a hobbyist training game developer person I work with people on. But anyway, he has a slide here from slide 29 about just this great grid. And again, this is now years out of date, so it's dovetailed even further. But as a starting point, not a bad start. To realize that you'll hear about, okay, my friend works on an educational game. It's about training people to use construction equipment. That's a true story. My friend Bob does that. Well, maybe that fits in one of these squares, but that's not all serious games can be or are, right? There's different reasons that we make serious games. There's different audiences that they're for. And another reason why this might be relevant to you, you might say, well, that's not necessarily my main thing, right? That's not why I got into using game technology or learning these skills or whatever. I will also say, and I don't want to out any company or team, one of the ways that some indie studios fund their creative projects without giving up their risk or their control to a outside publisher being on the hook for them or venture capitalist putting them under pressure to grow asymptotically by cloning competing products or something, is that they will fund their work partly by part of every single week taking consulting work for serious games. Because in these kind of scenarios, I think in mind, right, when I mentioned earlier flight simulators were decades ahead of the graphics capabilities of general consumer games. So literally at the same time as Asteroids, white lines on a black screen vector display was peak computer graphics for the arcade scene. Computer graphics for flight simulators were filled 3D polygons. Now, the frame rate was terrible. I don't think they were textured yet. So, you know, but filled 3D polygons in real time, not bad having full 3D, because the bar to beat for the aeronautics industry for a flight simulator was to not risk a multi-million-dollar jet crashing. And a lot of these kind of cases, they have serious, expensive, $100 million problems. That I've got. So another buddy of one of the guys I trained, he came out of Stanford with a PhD in optics, so he's smart, and I can't take any credit for that. We helped him make some educational games in Home Team, and then from that he went on to make some educational games for MIT and the game stuff. And now he helps develop software for helping people learn how to use expensive, complicated machinery in factories and science settings in ways that won't damage the machinery or hurt themselves. And again, the value for that, it may not have an enormous audience. It's not going to be a bestseller on Steam. It's not going to be up on the App Store. But the audience's need for that, as small as they are, has a really high value on. Don't cut off your hand. Don't destroy these extremely expensive pieces of equipment. And realizing that opportunity is part of what enables some businesses to fund their stuff. Where on the side, they're making executive training, occupational safety products. I funded my original contract stuff. My first contract gigs were advertising games that I made for a solar panel company. Friend made some for yogurt, needed a game made. And again, some of that space has changed or shifted how those things are getting made. Any given time it's changing though, adapting and evolving. So, but as a starting point, I really like this slide 29 from this old presentation. You can find it. I'll probably link to that in the description as well if you want to browse this. There's lots of cool things throughout this presentation. It's very dense, very interesting and impressive. Again, Ben Sawyer, I owe a lot to him. So this is an example from down the road out here at MIT. Contemporary, met a developer working on this, and again, it's a mental health game that some of the time they're not necessarily about classroom skills or even orientation or school stuff. It can be about socialization. It can be about habits. It can be about all these other things that we want to work on. And occasionally what games might help us do could be different than what a classroom setting is traditionally good for. This is part of the other exciting potential for educational games is while there's certainly a demand for help them, get better grades in programming class, history class, geology, and so on, there's also other needs that people growing up or people at any age need and want to work on, and games have potentially to do that. That is continuing to be explored to this day. So Passage, and I want to bring this up with an asterisk here of the developer, Jason Rower, made a lot of very influential projects to the indie scene. This was old enough that it's still a downloadable executable despite being a tiny game, so it gives you a sense of history. It's kind of pre-Flash. But it's this game, a real minimalist game about time passage, and he walks forward. He forms a relationship with his character who he doesn't have to, but if he does, he can't walk to some of the same places because he has a partner. They don't fit in the same spots. You can see kind of a fuzzy, blurry future. Lots of artistic choices being done here. Characters age as they walk. It became a real talking point for indies and academics and so on about what games can be and do and what they mean. It's a small thing, but again, what's nice about this as an example is while it clearly reflects iteration and design work, and I don't mean to trivialize the amount of work that goes into something that's minimalist, it's to realize that you can make a game about meaning and about concepts without necessarily having to invest a full oligarchy level budget into it. It can potentially be a lower budget of production or complexity. Oh, the disclaimer there is that Jason Rower in more recent years, very different path. He's given a good GDC talk several years ago. He now has some opinions that on a personal lens I don't necessarily see eye to eye on. No disrespect necessarily, but to say his older work is what I want to emphasize there. Slow Year, this is an example of Ian Bogost's work, and what I like about this one was it runs on an old Atari 2600 game console. It's an actual cart that he programmed an assembly for it. But it's a very, what we might call a boring game. We're looking at this tree. Thing blows by, back and forth. We're sitting here sipping coffee as the time of day changes. There's just 4 seasons on it. This is winter because you're staying inside. There's the time of day change. It's raining. Now, granted, this is a hard effect to do on an Atari 2600 from how the Stella chip right to the CRT, so again, not to trivialize the effort, but you can see aesthetically, it's about the concept. And again, it's where I want you to think about some of the time, it's about a thing to discuss, not necessarily a thing to play. I don't think people really sat here and played this blinking at the log floating by game a lot. And yet, it also, quite literally, and granted, obviously, he has credentials, he has community, he has connections, so not to say you could just make this and anybody would connect it to it, but it showed museums, right? It was at SF MoMA briefly. It had displays and kiosks set up places that has proper curated exhibits, and to recognize that there is other spaces in the world for these kind of projects to sit. In addition to the fact he sells it commercially as well. I think there used to be like a collector's edition that came with a more full kit and some nicer pieces, bigger box and so on. Different editions used to be available, or just versions to play in your ROM local emulator. So again, he's got more recent talks I want to encourage you to go check out. Search him. He's a super smart guy. I think these days he's at St. Louis instead of Georgia Tech, but academic. Facade, if you're not familiar with this, and I don't necessarily encourage this particular video, but you can go find videos of it. This was a big research project done, I think, at UC Santa Cruz. I think that's right. 2005-ish or so, and this is something where it is, I mean, granted, it's a research project, so it was predated modern AI by leaps and bounds, but it was trying to deal with kind of natural language input, and the characters trying to have dialogue in a way that part of the joke, part of why the meme community latched onto this, is from how awkward some of the interactions can be. But really, it's the reason it became a discussion piece for so many people is almost less so the AI system or the natural language parsing, and more so this is just using games and game-like technology, game-like interfaces, game-like interactions, not to jump on Koopas, not to shoot zombies, not to overcome the aliens, not to, I don't know, win at tower defense, but instead to deal with a social setting where people are just doing things that make you uncomfortable. And they're fighting, and you're trying to figure out, like, do I need to leave? And do I need to intervene? And am I part of this? And just the idea that games and game-like technology can do these things, can deal with these subject matters, is itself a thing sort of in the serious games, slightly niche space of it may not necessarily appeal one-to-one with your Call of Duty players, with your people who are enjoying general AAA Fortnite type stuff, or even indie games in the usual kind of sense, but it still might find a much more niche audience, which could include non-gaming people. And so one thing to keep in mind also when you're prototyping, if you're playtesting things that you're working on, and realize too, right, this is a fully polished multi-year project. This is not a quick prototype by any stretch of the imagination, despite, again, low fidelity. There's a lot happening under the hood here. It's to realize that you want to test your things with an audience besides just people who traditionally play games. It might speak to someone else. So you put this in front of a game player, they might say, I'm bored by this, I don't get this, this doesn't speak to my expectations and conventions. That may be true. You might find if you're working on something innovative, exploratory, a lot of these kind of projects may not speak to a game player, but they might actually really address a need and interest. And someone else who previously didn't have an interest in games says, actually, this is it. I care about this. I want to do more with this. I want to talk more about this. I get it. This interests me more than those action games, the strategy games, which again, there's nothing wrong with those, but they fit a certain audience and a certain expectation that's different from these other kind of projects. It's also to think about in terms of a prototyping lens. Look at a game like this, and there's a lot happening tech under the hood that's complicated. And what I'll suggest, right, is to not have to think in terms of, okay, well, how would I implement this in software immediately? It's a prototype. It might be something where you could be LARPing a test like this, and LARPing live action roleplay. My friend out here at Boston Northeastern, Caro, is an expert in it, so outside my domain here is my area of expertise. But basically, right, you could be writing scripts to help prepare these people for, okay, you play as Becky, she has these hangups. You're playing as Tom, Tom has these objectives. This person is playing as Billy, and then you drop a new stranger into the situation, they interact with them, and you're taking notes on how they interact, what questions they ask, how the scenarios go, to further evolve those scripts you're giving them as a way to prototype in a very efficient way with no software written. And then to realize there's also increasingly an audience. So with Indiecade, we have games that are being celebrated that are something that it is a live action experience only, where there's like a game in a van where the characters are performing parts of Shakespeare, but in a modernized context, where the person stuck in the van with them is a part of interacting with them, answering their questions, they're responding to it. And that is just a part of where interactive immersive theater is increasingly a part of the game scene. Obviously, it does not scale in the same way to millions of people overnight, but it finds its audience. And even in big cities, I know in Los Angeles, I assume out here in Boston and elsewhere, there's things we can get tickets to go to where there's a bunch of actors who are playing pre-prepared lenses and roles as Alice in Wonderland characters or other things based on their preparation. So it doesn't even have to necessarily find its way back to software. Those also have spaces in games. I want to point out as well, we're going to zoom back a little bit to the art scene. You'll see demos in airports, in museums, kiosks, and so on. Nice convention centers where there's a connector, web camera, and you're causing ripples to form, or you're causing the wall patterns to change in interesting ways. And the neat thing about these, right, is in many cases, and this is not all to demean the work, is to point out what's different about it. It may not be all that sophisticated from a tech lens as far as what's happening on top of what is frankly dropping in an API, initial demo, and then doing some filtering, doing some sort of visualization on top of it. But don't think about it as what happens in the software. This distracts us. It's about what happens with the people, right? Look at the people. How they're moving, how they're having fun, how they're getting out of their comfort zone, how they're doing things they wouldn't do otherwise, how they're interacting with each other, how they might be talking and laughing. And it can be hard for people who come from a space where they used to think about, I'm programming the AI in the system. What's complex is the interactions, and that's what's going to be a competitive advantage. In these kind of environments, in these kind of contexts, in these kind of uses of games technology, it's about the actions of the people that we can evoke, that we can get out of them, that we can get people to be a part of the performance is just part of the work we can do. And realize, again, there's a different need for that where it might be an installation that a store, a shop, a mall, or something might want to install. A couple of the real quick examples before I got to drop, but these came up when just discussing with some of my students. That Dragon Cancer, very serious game by developer, indies, awesome people, good team. About, I don't think there's any spoiler, they're pretty clear about what happens in this game. Maybe also a mild trigger warning for people. But it's the loss of a developer's child to cancer. And it's just dealing again with a topic that in many cases games don't touch, don't go near, because it can be a difficult, delicate subject to deal with well. But that can be part of the practice of what makes these kind of serious games interesting to people. And to realize that you can prototype parts of this, and you think about, okay, well, what's the most intense part? How would I later set that up and build up to it? But what can I even prototype to figure out, can I do this? Can I pull this off? Spiritfarer, I know some people who don't normally play a lot of games who this really spoke to them. As an indie game, it just met their needs for a type of a lens on the world. I don't want to give too much away about it. It is also a commercially successful game. So again, these don't necessarily the same thing as Dragon Cancer. Won awards, recognized by players. It can also appeal to gamers. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can find these nice Venn diagrams occasionally, like I saw from the Games for Change list. Or Before Your Eyes is this really innovative game where every time you blink, time passes. And so you see a progression of characters over time and history and changes in life around you. And it's just this neat lens for, you can simulate a lot of time passage with a lower budget, lower fidelity, telling a story in a curious way. And again, like this is a thing that was very prototypable in person with people run in and out of the room or change props or do other symbolic changes around them, pieces of paper, whatever you got to do to prototype. If you're applying this to your prototyping lens, realize you're never going to start looking like these kind of things or being these kind of things. You're always testing what can you do to answer these questions. But I hope those open up your lens a little bit, I hope. I want to throw one other example in there. JFK Reloaded, controversial for obvious reasons. It is a semi-documentary, semi-realistic game about simulating the assassination of JFK, the President of the United States. And it is obviously, many people find this despicable, sickening, but it's trying to deal with serious subject matter in a serious way about helping the player understand it, the history of it, asking why can't games deal with subjects like this, and it just opens up our lens to what else games can be and do outside of our usual of, we often avoid very serious topics in games where it's going to trivialize, it's going to attract negative attention, but it's just part of what games can do. So anyway, I hope this opened up your lens a bit for if you're at prototyping, when else? If you're not, when you're prototyping, trying stuff, seeing what can work, when else you can explore these kind of things? Because like the Tales team mentions at the start of their talk over games, one of the first projects that couldn't get it funded because people don't see that and understand where it's going. Prototyping is a way to sometimes explore these things to figure out, like, is there something here? Because you might be able to make something really valuable, really different that helps change how people look at stuff. They might play it only once. Maybe they only hear people talking about it and still changes forever how they think about something. To realize games have a potential is another helpful lens beyond, nothing wrong with, what's going to be top of Steam, what's going to be best selling on Quest, etc. Those are all valid questions as well. But I just want to recognize you can do so many more in other things with games technology and the skills you have. So I hope it's been interesting to you. Keep making games, keep making prototypes weekly. See you all around.